born in 1959 in Atlantic City as one of 9 children. During the early 1980s, Calloway worked as a PBX operator and hotel clerk for the Resorts International and Harrah's casinos. Then, he worked in the mercantile office of Atlantic City government for the next 23 years. Calloway quickly earned a reputation for being fair and helpful to the merchants, bus, taxi, and parking lot owners and operators he worked with. Many of them were recent immigrants from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other Asian countries. Over the years, many of them developed a rapport with Craig Calloway and began helping each other politically. When he first got involved in politics, Craig Calloway applied his skills and methods to elect only candidates affiliated with the Democratic Party. However, during the past 20 years, Calloway has chosen to support candidates who he believes best represent his views and interests, regardless of party. And indeed, looking at his general track record, it appears that Mr. Calloway has something about Midas touch when it comes to local elections. The synopsis continued, quote, Craig Calloway is recognized and respected as one of the best get-out-the-vote organizers in America. In 2001, Calloway then ran the get-out-the-vote drive in both the primary and general elections to elect Democrat Lorenzo Langford as Atlantic City mayor. In that same year, Calloway ran for office himself and was elected ward councilman from the 3rd Ward of Atlantic City. In 2004, Craig Calloway received national recognition when he applied his vote turnout techniques for John Kerry during the Bush-Kerry presidential election. And then, just as that earlier part of the synopsis mentioned, Mr. Calloway didn't appear to discriminate between Republicans and Democrats when offering his services. Quote, in 2013, Craig Calloway helped unseat Democrat Lorenzo Langford and elect Republican Don Guardian as mayor in Atlantic City, a town with an overwhelming majority of Democratic voters. In 2020, Calloway helped Amy Kennedy when she was a candidate for the Democratic Party nomination for the House of Representatives in South Jersey. Amy Kennedy defeated Callahan Harrison in the Democratic primary election in June. However, when Kennedy did not hire Calloway for the November election, Calloway worked for Jeff Van Drew, who had just switched to the Republican Party that January. Van Drew won re-election as a Republican in November of 2020. And by the way, it's worth mentioning that this work is quite lucrative for Mr. Calloway, evidenced by the fact that Congressman Van Drew paid Mr. Calloway a cool $135,000 for just a few months of work leading up to the November election. The summary continues. Quote, last November, Calloway helped Republican Tokyo Joe Donahue upset incumbent Democrat Eric Scheffler to win election as Atlantic County Sheriff. Calloway also helped Republican Jesse Kurtz win a landslide re-election to City Council in the mostly Democrat 6th Ward of Atlantic City. And so that is, if nothing else, an incredibly impressive resume. It appears that Mr. Calloway is able to elect whoever he works for, regardless of the challenges present in the electoral environment. In fact, here was how Mr. Calloway was described in a recent article that was published in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Quote, Calloway's vote-by-mail efforts are well known in Atlantic City, where he basically sets up shop in the clerk's office in Mays Landing, ferrying messengers in a white van to obtain mail-in ballots for voters. He has previously defended his actions as working within the state mail-in ballot laws. His influence was profound. And in fact, along that line of his influence, the chairman of the Atlantic County Republicans summed it up quite succinctly. Quote, he can make or break an election. However, in terms of how Mr. Calloway was able to achieve these amazing results, well, we now have some clues. Because in February of this year, Mr. Calloway was arrested and charged with federal voter fraud related to his work on mail-in ballots. And alongside the actual indictment, there was a short statement released by the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey, which said the following, quote, Mr. Craig Calloway was arrested today for his role in procuring, casting, and tabulating fraudulent mail-in ballots submitted in the November 8, 2022 general election.
No
Now, in terms of the specifics of what the feds were actually able to uncover, well, there was a 10-page indictment document that was released to the public outlining both the investigation as well as the findings. You can see the charging document up on your screen right now. And this indictment alleges that while working on Congressman Van Drew's re-election campaign in the year 2022, well, here's what happened. Quote, approximately 1 month before the November 8, 2022 general election, Calloway and others working at Calloway's direction approached numerous individuals in Atlantic City, promising to pay them $30 to $50 to act as purported authorized messengers for voters who supposedly wished to vote by mail. Okay, so just to pause here and summarize. Approaching the date of the actual midterm election, Mr. Calloway and his associates would search for people in Atlantic City and allegedly offer them somewhere between $30 to $50 for a single day's work. He wouldn't really explain to them what the day's work would entail, only that they would be acting as messengers for election-related matters. And so then, once Mr. Calloway found enough of these messengers, they would go and post up at the local county clerk's office. Quote, Mr. Calloway and his subordinates further offered to transport these individuals to and from the county clerk's office to perform this voting-related work. Upon arriving at the parking lot of the county clerk's office, an individual who accepted Callaway's offer for work would meet with Callaway's subordinates, or on occasion both, and provide Callaway or Callaway's subordinates with their identification. Callaway or Callaway's subordinates use the identification to complete the authorized messenger portion of the vote-by-mail application, and then provided the individual with multiple applications that Callaway or his subordinates had only moments earlier filled out. The majority of these purported messengers were unfamiliar with the role of an authorized messenger and did not know the voters listed on the vote-by-mail applications for whom they were supposedly serving as authorized messengers. And so, allegedly, these supposed messengers would be given these applications that were filled out right there on the spot in the parking lot by either Mr. Callaway himself or by one of his subordinates. Then, these so-called messengers would then head on over to the, quote, Atlantic County Clerk's Office, carrying anywhere from 1 to 4 completed vote-by-mail applications. As instructed by Mr. Callaway or his subordinates, these individuals provided County Clerk's Office personnel proof of identification and signed the vote-by-mail applications in the authorized messenger portion before handing these signed applications to the office personnel. The purported messengers waited while office personnel processed the applications and, if the applications were approved, provided to the purported messengers mail-in ballots for the voters listed on the applications. And so, in short, these messengers were allegedly being paid by Mr. Callaway to essentially just be runners. They would be given these absentee ballot applications right there in the parking lot. They would then take those applications inside to the county clerk's office. They would submit the applications. They would wait for them to be processed. And then, once they were processed, these messengers would be handed real mail-in ballots. Now, in New Jersey, state law requires that the messenger must deliver the mail-in ballot that they receive from the clerk directly to the voter who actually requested that ballot. And then the messenger must certify that they delivered the ballot to the actual human voter. But according to the indictment, that's not what happened here. Instead, after these messengers received the mail-in ballots from the county clerk's office, they left that office and handed the ballots directly to either Mr. Callaway or to one of his subordinates right there in the parking lot. After which, the indictment claims that the following happened. Quote, many of the mail-in ballots collected by Callaway or his subordinates were ultimately cast in the names of people who have confirmed that they did not vote in the 2022 general election, either in person or by submitting a mail-in ballot, and that they did not authorize Callaway or his subordinates or anyone else to cast ballots for them. Many of these mail-in ballots were counted towards in the election, meaning that the allegation here was that Mr. Callaway and his associates were voting on behalf of people who did not authorize them to do so and or weren't even aware that this was happening. And the indictment has quite a few examples of voters who the feds interviewed and who told the investigators that they definitely did not vote in the 2022 election, even though technically they did. There's also surveillance footage of the county clerk's office, which, again, allegedly shows this all taking place. Now, as always, everyone here in America is innocent until proven guilty, and these are, after all, just the charges that Mr. Callaway was arrested on. He has yet to be found guilty of anything, and therefore he should be presumed innocent until he has his day in court. Now, the specific charges against him, which is the procuring, casting, and tabulating of fraudulent ballots, carries a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison as well as a $250,000 fine. And it is also worth noting that the charges here stem only from the November 2022 midterm election, not from any of the prior elections before that. And as of right now, Mr. Callaway has not issued any statements on this particular matter. At the moment, Mr. Callaway is free after he posted a $50,000 unsecured bond. Now, after his arrest, Mr. Michael Suleiman, who is the current chairman of the Atlantic County Democrat Party, he released a statement saying this in part, quote, it's no secret that candidates from both parties have hired Callaway in the past to help them win elections. Those who hired him cannot plead ignorance now. Everyone in Atlantic County knows exactly what Callaway's operation is and the blatant illegality of it all. He further added that he will be using this arrest as an impetus to lobby both the state legislature as well as the governor's office to pass new laws explicitly banning the practice of paying people to act as ballot messengers, which, for your reference, is currently not illegal in the state of New Jersey. Now, whether that lobbying effort will go anywhere is anyone's guess. In the meantime, Mr. Callaway will be having his trial later this year, and I'll bring you any updates as they're made. Black hole, as soon as it was passed, the U.S. Supreme Court handed a major win for personal property owners across the entirety of America. Specifically, in a 9-0 unanimous decision, the U.S. Supreme Court, they, for one, significantly limited the scope of the Clean Water Act as well as the EPA, and in so doing, they limited the federal government's ability to dictate what you and I can or cannot do on our own properties. Although, to explain the details, as well as the implications that this particular case has on everyday Americans like you and I, let me back up for a quick second and give you the background and the details here, right after you take a super quick moment to smash those like and subscribe buttons so that this information can reach ever more people via the YouTube algorithm. Now, to start with, imagine this scenario. You purchase a vacant lot of land near a beautiful lake in the state of Idaho with the intention of building a home for you and your family. You then hire a company to start backfilling this empty lot with dirt in order to prepare the foundation on which you'll actually be building your home. However, once you start this process, agents of the EPA suddenly show up on your property during construction and they tell you that you cannot build a home there because your property contains a wetland. And by backfilling your own property, you're actually in violation of the Clean Waters Act. You're confused. You look around your property and you don't understand because you clearly do not have any wetlands. However, the EPA informs you that the so-called wetland takes the form of a drainage ditch, which eventually feeds into a creek, which then eventually feeds into a local lake. And so, because you had a drainage ditch on your property, the EPA tells you that you have to restore the site to its previous condition, and if you don't comply, they will hit you with penalties of up to $40,000 per day. As crazy as that scenario sounds, it's exactly what happened back in the year 2007 to the Sackett family over in the state of Idaho. However, what the EPA didn't expect was that this episode, it wound up serving as a catalyst, which then kicked off a chain of events, which eventually saw this family's case go before the U.S. Supreme Court, not once, but twice. Because you see, in 2007, when this whole episode took place, the Sackett family, they initiated a lawsuit against the EPA, arguing that what was taking place was unlawful. However, the EPA itself, which at the time was emboldened by the victory of Barack Obama in 2008, was making the counter-argument that the Sackett family did not have a right to sue them over the Clean Water Act. Forgetting any particular details of the case itself, the EPA was making the foundational argument that this family did not even have a right to bring a legal challenge against the agency at all. Now, eventually, after 5 full years of this legal back and forth, the case did wind up in front of the U.S. Supreme Court for the first time. This was in the year 2012, and at the time, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Sackett family, saying that actually they did have a legal right to challenge the EPA. And by the way, just as an aside, this really does represent the enormous challenge that common Americans face when trying to fight with the federal government. Think about that. It took 5 years for this family to finally establish the fact that they had a right to actually sue the EPA. Anyway, in 2012, this meant that after 5 years, their actual real case could begin. However, it did not go well. That's because both the lower court as well as the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, they both ruled in favor of the EPA. However, the Sackett family then appealed that decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, who then eventually took up the case. And in May of last year, in May of 2023, 16 full years after the initial incident occurred, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously, in a 9-0 ruling, ruled in favor of the Sackett family. And in so doing, they stripped away the Biden administration's attempt to expand the Clean Waters Act. And before I read to you the Supreme Court ruling itself, let me give you a brief history of the Clean Water Act because it becomes very relevant to this discussion. Back in 1972, Congress took a law that was already on the books called the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. They reorganized it and expanded the language, and the end result became known as the Clean Water Act of 1972. And as the name implies, the main goal of the Clean Water Act is to prohibit the discharge of pollution from a point source into navigable waters within the U.S. Now, on the surface, that makes sense. However, just like with any federal law, the key lies in the details and the definitions. Because, for one, pollutants does not just refer to industrial waste. According to U.S. code, within the context of the Clean Water Act, pollutants also include things like rocks, sand, as well as dirt. And then, secondly, in terms of what constitutes navigable waters, well, that's defined within the law as follows. Quote, the waters of the United States, including territorial seas. And so, because of this definition, waters of the United States, or WOTUS for short, became a broad term which established the scope of the federal government's jurisdiction. But the problem, ever since the adoption of the Clean Water Act all the way back in the 1970s, is that nowhere in the actual text of the law does it clearly define what WOTUS is, what waters of the United States actually means. And because of that, interpreting what it means, and therefore figuring out the scope of government power, has been left up to individual presidents as well as their administrations. And so what we've been seeing for the past 50-odd years is that, on the one hand, you have environmental groups as well as Democrat presidents pushing to broaden the definition of WOTUS, while on the other hand, you've had Republican presidents limit what constitutes as WOTUS. And so one side, it says that it's acting to protect the environment, while the other side says that they're acting to protect individual property rights. This is the pendulum that's been swinging back and forth, again, for the past 50 or so odd years, one administration to the next. In 2015, President Obama expanded the definition of waters, but then in 2020, President Trump revised the definition and he reduced what constituted protected wetlands. But subsequently in 2023, the Biden administration changed the definition again, and in so doing, they significantly expanded federal authority by making WOTUS, the waters of the U.S., include everything, from ponds to even puddles. However, this Joe Biden change did not last long. That's because just 4 short months after he made it, the U.S. Supreme Court finally issued their official ruling in the case of Sackett versus the EPA, which is the case involving this Idaho family. Specifically, the decision, which was made unanimously, with all justices ruling against the EPA. And in so doing, the U.S. Supreme Court, they invalidated a huge part of the EPA's new definition as established by the Biden administration. Here's part of what the U.S. Supreme Court majority opinion said. Quote, the Clean Water Act's use of waters refers only to geographical features that are described in ordinary parlance as streams, oceans, rivers, and lakes, and to adjacent wetlands that are indistinguishable from those bodies of water due to a continuous surface connection. In other words, the U.S. Supreme Court, which, just by the way, for your reference, was written by Justice Sam Alito, it laid out a new 2-part test for determining whether the Clean Water Act has jurisdiction over a specific property. Firstly, the adjacent body of water must constitute an actual waterway of the United States, which the Supreme Court defined as a relatively permanent body of water connected to traditional interstate navigable waters. And then, secondly, the wetland on a person's property must have a continuous surface connection with that adjacent waterway such that it makes it difficult to determine where the water ends and the wetland begins. That is the new 2-part test established by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so, using this new definition, the small drainage ditch on the Sackett family's Idaho property did not qualify as a wetland, and therefore, the Clean Water Act did not apply. All it took was a cool 16 years of litigation to figure that fact out. However, as a result of that 16-year-long battle, the EPA was forced once again to revise the definition of the waters of the U.S. in order to conform with what the U.S. Supreme Court wrote. And because of that change, well, a lot of people across the entirety of America are no longer subject to the EPA's jurisdiction. For instance, according to estimates from state officials, in the western part of the U.S., which has a really arid climate, more than 90% of surface waters are now exempt from the Clean Waters Act, which, on the one hand, is seen as a victory for advocates of property rights, since they see this ruling as a significant blow to an ever-overreaching bureaucratic government that is dead set on imposing climate change restrictions by any means possible. On the flip side, however, you have environmental groups who, after this U.S. Supreme Court ruling passed, expressed worry that these new limited definitions will wind up leading to an uptick in pollution, including more forever chemicals being dumped into American waterways. Although, realistically, what's going to wind up happening is just like what happened with abortion. The authority over all these waterways will now go back to the state and local governments, and it'll be up to them to find a balance between protecting our collective water as well as protecting our collective property rights. But in the meantime, as a practical matter, this U.S. Supreme Court unanimous decision eliminated one large layer of bureaucracy for most people, making it easier for land developers, for farmers, for ranchers, as well as for common property owners to expand and to build a property that they already own. And by the way, just as a total aside, when we were doing the research for today's episode, we actually wanted to reach out and to speak to Mr. Michael Sackett for an interview to get his take on the case as well as his 16-year-long battle and his victory. However, it turns out that, well, this case took 16 years to get across the finish line. The incident took place in the year 2007, and then the final verdict from the U.S. Supreme Court, it came down in the year 2023. However, in that time frame, in the middle of all that, Mr. Michael got arrested, charged, and pled guilty to trying to meet up with a 12-year-old girl in order to do things that would get you arrested for trying to do with a 12-year-old girl. Essentially, he was caught up in a sting operation by law enforcement trying to pay for things I will not mention. And so we decided to not pursue the interview with him. And that just makes the case a little bit, in my opinion, more interesting, because on the one hand, this man's perseverance for 16 full years pushed this U.S. Supreme Court case all the way across the finish line, and in so doing, he helped to secure more property rights for Americans like you and me, which on the one hand is great. But on the flip side, during that period of time, he was also found guilty of trying to meet up with and pay for something with a 12-year-old child. You can make up your own mind in terms of forming an opinion about what that all means. I just present to you the facts. And actually, I'd like to give a big thanks to our intrepid researcher, Mr. Eric Schumacher, who discovered this fact. This is a picture of Eric Schumacher doing normal research, and here's a picture of him finding out this piece about the 12-year-old child. Thank you for your service. And then, lastly, if you enjoyed today's episode and you're just thinking to yourself, man, I love this content, I just wish Roman would publish more episodes every single week. Well, you're in luck, because I do. Over on Epic TV, our awesome no censorship video platform, I publish anywhere between 1 to 3 exclusive episodes of Facts Matter every single week. And so if you'd like to get access to those exclusive episodes, including a huge backlog from the last 3 years, now's a great opportunity, because the Epic Times is running a phenomenal sale. Just 25 cents a week for the whole year, which if you do the math, works itself out to just be a single $1 a month. And so if you're indeed looking for an honest source of uncensored news, well, you can check out Epic TV as well as the Epic Times more broadly. I'll throw a link to the sale page. It's right there at the top of the description box below. You can just click on that link, and you can head on over to the sale page, take advantage of the sale, $1 a month. Can't beat that price. You can, of course, even cancel anytime. The idea is just to get you in the door, get you hooked on the content, and hopefully you'll be a subscriber for a long, long time to come. Years, perhaps even decades. Again, the link is right there at the top of the description box below. I hope that you join us over on Epic Times and EpicTV.com. And then, until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epic Times. Stay informed. Most importantly, stay free.
In many ways, we don't even recognize it.
In Hillsdale College's most popular online course, Constitution 101, distinguished politics professors teach you the meaning and history of the Constitution, how it's been undermined, and what it will take to restore it. Absolutely free at learnfromhillsdale.org. You'll learn the principles.
The median age of a first marriage has never been higher. Now, you may be thinking this is only affecting single adults. Well, not exactly. According to Pew Research, 1 in 4 parents living with their child are unmarried. And let's take a look at how many children are currently living with either one parent or no parent.